So I'm watching the Skylar fiction debate 2-on-2. Is belief in God rational? And I'm kind of having fun with it, actually. It's so far, I've watched the first hour. So far, nothing, we're not hearing from Dr. Josh at all. I don't know. I don't know why. So far, he's been quiet. But it's actually kind of an interesting conversation thus far. Skylar brings up one of his go-to arguments. One of his standard go-to arguments is cries about the Amalekites. Yeah, crying his eyes out about the poor Amalekites. God was so mean to the Amalekites. In this particular debate, he does kind of admit a little that his go-to argument about the Amalekites is only intended as an internal critique of Christianity. Other than that, it doesn't really make all that much sense. You know, if God is so loving, why did he do this with the... If the God of the Bible is all loving and all good, how can we justify his treatment of the Amalekites? Now, the problem with this go-to argument, yeah, I get it as an internal critique of Christianity, but it only really works against someone like Matt Slick or a true Bible literalist. And the problem with Skylar's go-to argument is it's presupposing inerrancy. In order for it to make any type of sense of an argument, you'd have to be a total Bible literalist, and Skylar is not. So what on earth does he care? What on earth does he care? Do an internal critique of his own argument. In order for that to be so groundbreakingly challenging, he didn't present it in this particular version as groundbreakingly challenging to him as an ethical thing. But sometimes he does. And in order for that to be challenging as an actual ethical quandary, you would have to be a really committed Bible literalist. If you don't think the Bible's inerrant, then what on earth do you care if there's this, you know, the terrible treatment of the Amalekites? Maybe they were just exaggerating. Maybe the Hebrews who were writing it down were just running off at the mouth. Our God is the biggest, baddest. Makes sense to me, doesn't it? Maybe they're just going something like, our God is the biggest, baddest God on the planet. And if you don't believe us, we're going to destroy your village. We're going to kill off all your women. We're going to kill your children. We're going to salt the earth so that nothing grows there for the next 200 years. So help me God. Our God will triumph. We're going to destroy you. And then like, go, go, go. There's some of that written into it. Is there not? Is there not? Yeah, we're going to come smash your children's heads against the stones. There's some of that written into it. Is there not? And if you're not a really committed literalist, why on earth do you care about that? I get why you try to, you know, run circles around Matt Slick with that to get him to see that his literalism is hard to defend. But if you're not a literalist and Skylar's not a literalist, then why on earth do you care? Now, he wasn't actually arguing it from the point of view this particular time as he cares. This is presenting a really big ethical quandary for him, but he has in the past. So, just thought I'd say that. Going further with it, if you're trying to defend it along righteous grounds, if you're trying to say the character of God is at issue because of the destruction of innocence, destruction of children, the only times where these have parallels in history, in the actual history of the world that I can think of, 3 examples. The firebombing of Dresden. This is the actual history of the world you live in. The firebombing of Dresden, Sherman's march to the sea, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, 4 examples. Fine, I said 3 examples, I listed 4. You said 3 exampos, Craig, you listed 4. All right, nitpick. Nitpick, why don't you? You see, okay, fine, 4 examples. Now, in, for example, the firebombing of Dresden, it's kind of interesting because they actually present ethical dilemmas to people, to people thinking about them to this day. There's a really good book written about the firebombing of Dresden, Slaughterhouse 5. I think it's Slaughterhouse 5, Kurt Vonnegut. Slaughterhouse 5? For some reason, that doesn't sound right. Slaughterhouse... I think it's Slaughterhouse 5. Really good book about the firebombing of Dresden. And it presents an ethical quandary to this day. Did we go too far? Now, if those are specific examples that would fall into the category, let's just say that there's a sovereign God in control of World War II. That would fall directly under the wrath of God. It seemed to go a step further than just defeating the Nazis because it was militarily useless. And it was one of the most beautiful cities in the world prior to World War II. Honestly, Dresden, it's still kind of, you can still see the ghost of what it was if you look it up now, because they rebuilt it as it was. So you can tell the Dresden Opera House, you know, it's actually, at the time it was called the Florence on the Elbe, and it was considered one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. So the idea of just firebombing it, and it was kind of just done just for the sake of destroying it. There was no military purpose to it whatsoever, and they firebombed it, which means it exploded into flames and killed thousands of people. if there was such a thing as a wrath of God visited upon the inhabitants of Nazi Germany, that was it right there. Militarily useless, kids were burned up in the flames, you know. There is something about to be said. Now, I'm not saying this is, I'm just saying this is something to consider. We don't cry a lot about what happened to the Nazis. Berlin was bombed round the clock, for example, last year of the war. Round the clock. 24 hours a day. Sirens going off. Airplanes flying overhead. Bombs dropping. Round the clock. Not a single minute was it not being bombed for the last year. It might have been the last 2 years. Certainly children are being harmed in that. We don't spend a lot of time crying our eyes out about it. Why? Because there's something in us that intuitively understands. I'm just offering this as a think about it. That there is two levels of accountability. Collective accountability and individual accountability. Of the two, the individual accountability is far more important. Obviously, a child born into Nazi Germany is somewhat innocent. You know, 14-year-old child, even a Hitler Youth. You had to join the Hitler Youth. So even a Hitler Youth in Berlin is somewhat innocent of the crimes of Germany as a whole, but also somewhat implicated in them. That's the point. There is such a thing as collective accountability. Now, who decides who's innocent and who's guilty? Ultimately, God. You stand before God and He decides. And according to Christian theology and according to everything in my heart, He's going to decide fairly. If you think it'd be unfair for Him to judge like a 14-year-old Nazi youth who had to join the Hitler Youth as the same way as a fully committed Nazi who's, you know, guarding a concentration camp and committing atrocities, obviously God would think that too. Hello? Obviously, if you see a disparity in those two people, so would God. You don't have any type of a really like sophisticated moral compass that wasn't put into you by God if God exists. In other words, you can't out moral or out righteous or out God. If you can perceive an immorality or you can perceive something as unjust, then God, who's written justice into your very heart, would be able to do it too. Not sure if I said that in a way that made complete sense, but obviously there's something to be said of collective accountability. So the 14-year-old who's in the Hitler Youth, his parents are killed because there are bombs going off overhead. It's terrible for him. And he didn't necessarily do anything to have deserved it, but he is part and parcel of the culture of corruption that is Nazi Germany. So there's some accountability. The only people who are not held accountable to that are the people who actively resisted. Your Bonhoeffers. Or your priest who hid Jewish people. Priest didn't do it. Bonhoeffer was a Christian. You know, maybe the Christians don't have a great record of, you know, putting Jews in the basement, but they don't have a completely dismal one either. There were Christians, Corrie ten Boom, Bonhoeffer, who got in trouble. Corrie ten Boom hid people, tried to protect them, wound up in a concentration camp herself. Pretty sure that's based on a true story, hiding place. Pretty sure it's a true story. I don't know that for a fact, but I think so. Decent movie. Check it out if you get a chance. That's the story. She was in Holland and they hid Jews and she wound up in a concentration camp herself because they tried to protect Jews from the Nazis. So it's dangerous to do. Now, any given person in a system that corrupt and that evil through and through has some culpability. Some culpability just by virtue of the fact that you're born into it. That's what the Bible is kind of trying to argue for. That's something endemic to the human race. And if you think about it in a larger picture, Nazism was not perpetrated by monsters from outer space that were completely inhuman in all of their attributes. That was perpetrated by human beings who are perfectly capable of that type of cruelty, which means you are perfectly capable of that type of cruelty too. However moral or good you think you may be, given the right preconditions, given the right cultural conditions, you could probably do something like that. Most of you, or many of you, maybe not all of you. That's the point. There's collective accountability. That's the point of having a Savior. That there is something in our very nature that is capable of crimes like that. That's the point of we need a Savior. That's what we're capable of, left to our own devices. That's the lesson you're supposed to draw. Now, I'm not sure if I just said that crystal clear, but that's the actual Christian moral lesson. That's what people are capable of. left to their own devices, free to form societies the way they, according to corrupt versions of what is right and wrong, they will upside down morality and they will create the cruelest societies in the history of the world. Why? Because that's what's written into the very DNA of human beings. That's what you were supposed to garner from that. And science won't save you. Nazi scientists, last time I checked, were every bit the equal of American scientists. Maybe slightly worse. So we got the atom bomb before they did. Had they kept Einstein, they might have beaten us to that. and then what would have happened? So anyways, rambling a little. It's an interesting conversation, but I just thought I'd add that in there. There are places in history of the world. Firebombing of Dresden was one. Nagasaki, it kind of answers the question that Tyler asked. One of the things they agonized over before the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is, had they not dropped the atom bomb, they would have had to invade Japan. And if you've watched any of those documentaries of invasions of Japanese islands, it didn't go very well. Why? Because Japanese were even more hardcore than Nazis, and they would fight to the bitter end, and they would rather kill themselves, 5 minutes before you stormed the place, and fight right down to the last soldier, then surrender. To them, to surrender was a great shame. So they would, even Nazis, they were even more hardcore than committed SS soldiers and Nazis. Nazis in Germany could surrender. Japanese almost never did. Why? Because it was considered a shame, dishonor. So they would fight you down to the last man, and if you were storming, then they would, the last guy would pop a grenade and take 10 of you out with them. So they were contemplating overrunning. They were going to have to invade Japan. My uncle, my Italian uncle on my mother's side, was on a boat ready to be invading Japan. Had they invaded Japan? And they didn't. Why didn't they? Because they dropped a bomb. Saved a lot of lives in the long run. So his question is actually one worth considering. But when you start considering these from theological grounds, Skylar asked an interesting question somewhere along the lines of, would it be better for God to just have annihilated so that the destruction needed to have occurred? And probably. But when you start asking these questions along theological grounds, you've got to factor in omnipotence and pure righteousness and pure justice as if those are actual capabilities that God possesses. Because that's the only way to see this clearly. That's the only way to see this clearly. Otherwise, you are not doing the real theological thinking it through. You have to think it through from the point of view as if I think that's unjust, and who am little old me? I think that's unjust. Skylar does this a lot. He wrestles with the Bible a lot. And most of what he's wrestling with is, I just want to point out, theologically speaking, if you can perceive it as unjust, if you, anyone, not necessarily Skylar, anyone listening to me, if you go to yourself, wow, that doesn't seem just, and you are trying to actually wrestle with the theological implications of an omnipotent God who created the very concept of justice, guess what? They could have got that too. It's not like you're more just than, I'm more righteous than God, because that's what atheists do all the time, and they don't realize how ridiculous it sounds. I've had actual atheists say this to me. I am more moral than your God. I am more moral than your Savior. No, you're more moral than, perhaps the most dim-witted interpretation of what God did in the Old Testament. Maybe. Maybe. But even then, I'm going with God. Sorry, pal. I've had atheists say that to me, I promise. I've said to them, you sound like you almost think you're more moral than God. And they've taken a page out of the, what's her face? Who was that woman who had she used to have a meme that was Tracy Harris. Take a page out of Tracy Harris meme playbook. I am more moral than your God. The only reason you think that is because you haven't thought through the theological implications of the being we are positing exists. You haven't really thought it through. That's why. That's why you give yourself all these great credibilities for being this unbelievably moral being who's more moral than the God of the universe, the creator of morality, this isn't an argument for God's existence. So if you're an atheist,